followed by a Q&A and a discussion at the end of all the 4 presentations. So to the audience, feel free to put any questions you may have in the chat and clearly indicating the speaker for which you have a question, and we will get back to them during our Q&A session and discussion in the end, for which we have around 15 minutes. So to recap, we will gather all questions and they will be answered after all 4 presenters have given their presentation. And then please note that at the end of the meeting, you can also join our networking events. I have to apologize for today. I'm having a bit of a cold, but I hope you can hear me fine. And I hope the rules of the game are clear. So if yes, I can go on with introducing our first speaker of tonight, Su-Ming Khoo from the National University of Ireland, Galway, with a presentation on climate crisis as a human crisis facing inhumanity with ethical creativity. Su-Ming Khoo is a lecturer in political science and sociology and cluster leader of the Whitaker Institute on Environment, Development and Sustainability and the Rhine Institute on Socioeconomic Impact Research Clusters at the National University of Ireland in Galway. She holds a PhD in sociology and social policy from the Queen's University of Belfast. Her research interests include international human rights, global public goods and ethical perspectives on international development, including human development and capabilities approaches, post-colonial, feminist and ecological perspectives, and strong sustainability. Su-Ming is engaged in inter- and transdisciplinary research and public scholarship. She researches and teaches international public advocacy and activism, focusing on human development and capabilities, the role of higher education, decolonial approaches to research and teaching, and global ethics in higher education curriculum. Su-Ming is a member of the International Sociological Association research committees on social movements, social transformations, and sociology of development, sociology of health, human rights and environmental sociology, and a member of the Human Development and Capability Association Ethics, Foundational Issues and Human Rights thematic groups, and the Academic Network on Global Education and Learning, also known as ANGEL. Su-Ming, I gladly give you the floor for your presentation. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Els, for that very nice introduction. And I hope you can see my screen now. So the topic that I'm going to speak on today is climate crisis as a human crisis, and our need to respond to this, to face inhumanity with ethical creativity. I thank Deborah Green for the use of this image, amazing painting that she's made. So just to start then, I want to reflect on a blog written by the legal scholar Itama Mann on armed lifeboats and this dual process that was taking place as he was reflecting on the end of the COP26 negotiations in Glasgow at the end of last year, and at the same time then a refugee crisis at Bruges, which is on the border between Belarus and Poland. And it seemed to him then that there were two things happening that were changing in the world, between the world as we knew it and the world as it is emerging. For international rules and customs, norms, we used to know a world which governed by a norm of non-refoulement, of a basic refugee protection. And this is no longer the case. In the world as it is emerging, we see a customary international rule that was not there in the past, but now we hope that we are getting more international rules to control greenhouse gases. So it seemed that there are two different things going on and two different directions of change for the world. One where rules which exist are becoming non-existent in the area of refugee protection, and another in which were non-existent in the past and are becoming existent in the area of greenhouse gas emissions. And he says that for refugees, for those who continue to be displaced by climate change and its economic and health fallouts, the European lifeboat, even if it will become increasingly less carbon dependent, is not only revoking non-refoulement, it is preparing its guns. So this is the current crisis, a crisis limitations of human rights protection, where we see that displacement of human people is growing continuously. Even before the current Russian invasion of Ukraine and the additional pressure on refugees that this has created, there was 1 in 95 people forcibly displaced in 2020, and this had increased a lot by about half, right, from what it was only 10 years before. And what we see very poignantly, I think, is Europe opening its borders to displaced Ukrainians because of the invasion. But yet this longer standing problem, which was much more manifest after the borders began to close in 2016, we can see that there are more and more people, and with the pandemic as well, people stranded seeking protection. So I want to put a bit of emphasis on this idea of climate refugees, which is putting more pressure on our principles and practices, and meaning that we have to evolve the way we think about human rights principles and practices in a world of warming climate and climate displacement. And as the Filippo Grandi, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, says, if you have an immediate threat to your life due to climate change, due to the climate emergency, if you cross the border, you go to another country, you should not be sent back, non-refoulement, because you would be at risk of your life, just as in a war or a situation of persecution. So the fact that there are so many climate refugees and other kinds of refugees mean that today we need to broadly and critically revise the way we think about our international order, an order that evolved since the First World War and the failure of the League of Nations, and how we think about the international order, human rights, development, security. All of these need to be thought again, because as the UNDP says in its new special report on human security, new threats in the Anthropocene demand greater solidarity. And in the United Nations human rights instruments, the Convention on Civil Political Rights, General Comment 36 on the right to life, states that the right to life is a right that should not be interpreted narrowly. Yet the current case law, which had concluded the decision at the Human Rights Committee in 2020 on the long-standing case of Tetiora versus New Zealand, demonstrate that the current human rights framework places a very, very high bar on climate refugees. So although 2 of the judges on the Human Rights Committee found that there was a reason why Tetiora should be given asylum status, refugee status in New Zealand, the rest of the judges agreed that that he and his family had not yet reached the bar where he had demonstrated enough that he was really a climate refugee. And I just want to go back then for a moment to this image of the armed lifeboat, which comes from the Indian writer Amitav Ghosh's writings on the Great Derangement. He says, to think back to 2 decades ago, when already environmental scientists had noticed that solidarity was declining, and instead we are seeing a rise of hostility and cynicism towards others. And this tendency to distance and deter others, and to think of others as having no faces. And the fact is that the climate transition requires us to face problems and face the people who have the greatest problems, because climate transition means polarization and confrontation of those who need refuge and help, and those who have been displaced, and those who are in a position to help them. But what we have seen is these pushback chains, the criminalization of the human rights encounter, the decline of solidarity, and the return of the lifeboat as a cynical figure of cynical environmentalism, replaying its history, which really came from the writings of a well-known anti-immigration and racist environmental scientist, Garrett Hardin, whose essays, Living on the Lifeboat and Tragedy of the Commons, are very well known. And really, this is a legacy which sees authoritarian nationalism, colonialism, racism connected to environmentalism in a way that makes cooperation impossible, seen as something that shouldn't be done. And this is a failure of imagination, which requires, as Ghosh says, an imaginative and creative response. Because the idea, the knowledge of crisis actually deepens the crisis of humanity. And in the face of this, we need to face our inhumane tendencies with epistemologies of coordination to reduce harm. So just to finish then, to say that we need ethical change today to recognize the right to life with dignity of all and reverse dehumanizing tendencies to avoid and deter the ethical encounter. Human rights needs to extend solidarity beyond the exclusions of the national lifeboat. But in order to extend the solidarity, we need to develop ethical imagination and ethical know-how. An alternative strategy of global solidarity must directly face and reverse the idea of securing only a single armed lifeboat, our nation, and securing that while violently pushing back the poor and migrants at the borders. So can human rights protection extend towards climate change, adaptation, and loss and damage reparations using migration as a form of adaptation and reparation for loss and damage? We're seeing now both a new centrality for new decolonial, transdisciplinary approaches of thinking in theory and also approaching the way we do human rights and we do science and research. And in terms of fiscal space, we see new creativity possible because fiscal space is afforded by modern migration theory, which will support the human rights rationale while challenging the orthodox macroeconomics of preventative migration using economic evidence from natural experiments. Okay, I'm going to stop the share here, and I think I've taken just 10 minutes.
Perfectly, just in time. Thank you, Su-Ming, on the urgent need for ethical creativity. So now I'm turning to Professor Inmaculada Martinez-Zarzoso from the University of Göttingen with a presentation on climate change, natural disasters, and international migration across country level analysis. Prof. Inmaculada Martinez-Zarzoso is professor at the Universities of Göttingen and at UNU in Spain. She obtained her PhD in economics from the University of Birmingham in England in 1998. She has extensive teaching experience in several bachelor and master programs at the Universities of Birmingham, Valencia, and Nottingham, and has been actively engaged in building and managing international networks. Currently, she chairs the cluster in social sciences, economics, and law of the ENLIGHT Consortium, and is a member of the steering committees of the Center for Global Migration Studies and the Clinic Health Network, as well as a board member of INFER. She has advised numerous international institutions and governmental bodies, including the World Bank, the OECD, the Commonwealth Secretariat, and the German Ministry of Development, and served as editor and associate editor in several international journals. Currently, she is editor of the Journal of International Development and associated editor of the Journal of Applied Economics and Applied Economic Analysis. Her fields of research include international economics, environmental economics, and development economics. She is the author of 2 books and more than 100 published articles listed in the Web of Science. Her work appeared in the Journal of International Economics, the Review of International Economics, Ecological Economics, Environmental and Resource Economics, and the Journal of Common Market Studies, among many others. Professor Inma, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Els, for the very generous introduction. So now I'm going to share my screen. And hopefully you can see my slides. So I'm going to present this lecture, and I'm going to focus on the interlink between climate change, natural disasters, and international migration at the country level. And I'm going to motivate, actually, let me see. I'm going to motivate this talk with the slide that you can see now and with the map that you can see on the left-hand side with the 10 largest displacement events of 2016 that were indeed climate related, and you can see how China is actually the top country in the ranking concerning those climatic events that are leading to displacements. Also, the Philippines, India, and Bangladesh, that you cannot see here, have been the 4 countries in the top of the ranking in the year 2020. Then basically what I wanted to emphasize here is that this nexus between climate change and migration has been already addressed since the 1990s by environmentalists, demographers, social and political scientists, as well as economists. And at the very beginning, there was a lot of media coverage, but not that much academic research. Academic research started mostly with case studies, and then it was extended to empirical studies quantifying this impact globally, specifically in the 21st century. Some numbers that you can see also below. Myers predicted that by 2050, climate change would displace more than 200 million individuals. However, this number didn't have enough scientific basis, and official estimates are not that accurate. So the number can go from 25 million to 1 billion, according to the International Organization of Migration. And if we consider internal displacement, with data from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, then this number amounts 30 million displacements related to climate change. And if we compare this figure with conflict displacement, for conflicts, this will be 10 million in 2020. Then if we focus on these displacements due to climate change, we can also distinguish between slow onset events and fast onset. What is slow onset? This is changes in mostly average temperatures and average precipitation over long periods of time, whereas the fast onset refer to higher frequencies of extreme events. And we all know from the news that the frequency of extreme climatic events has been also increasing over time. And in this decade, we have many more extreme events than in the past decade and the previous one. And if we continue like this, what is going to happen? Let me just use the pointer. Here, you can see that the more likely scenario is going to be that the average temperature is going to increase in this century up to around 3 degrees Celsius if we don't do much more, if the effort to reduce the accumulation of emissions in the atmosphere is not increased. With the current policies, we are going to be reaching those 3 degrees Celsius increase by the end of the century. So therefore, more and more has to be done by the politicians. And indeed, the population in Europe is already recognizing this. Europeans consider climate change to be one of the most serious problems facing the world. And the question here is, to what extent do climatic events then foster migration? There we can distinguish between internal and international migration. And one problem that we face when we try to quantify whether actually this migration is, or what part of this migration is originated by climatic phenomena, then one problem is measurement. How to measure international migration? Sometimes some authors use urbanization, and those are displacements from the countryside to the cities, or household size. When the household size decreases, is because sometimes somebody is moving somewhere, and those are based on survey data. International migration, for this we have official statistics, and also we have asylum seekers, but none of those sources are very, very accurate. So therefore there is a problem of measurement. But in any case, migration has been seen more and more, as we have learned already in the previous presentation, as an adaptation strategy. And in some previous work that I did with co-authors, we presented in this first paper, Cattaneo et al. 2019, a synthesis report of the current state of the age of migration in the era of climate change. And there we distinguish between fast onset and slow onset events. We also revise projections in migration and revise strategies and policy recommendations. Whereas in the second work with Andreas and Chris, what we did here is to quantify indeed to what extent the slow onset events were leading to international immigration, and we found that indeed sustained increase in average temperatures were actually causing migration, and we were able to identify this effect using a model that is called gravity model of migration. And only to mention that the main transmission channel was the decrease in the productivity of agriculture in many countries in Africa and Asia. And this led me to the next study that I did in 2020, in which the idea was the same, to focus on this slow onset increase in average temperature and decrease in some countries, of course, of average precipitation, and whether this was leading to international migration. And what I found in this study is that the answer to the question is yes, but the effect is very heterogeneous. And we found that this was especially the case for a set of countries located in Africa and Central Asia, the ones you can see in blue color in the map. Also important to mention that migration is mostly prevalent in countries that are classified according to the World Bank classification are upper middle and lower middle income countries. And you can see this in red and blue in the graph in the bottom. And that means that sometimes we also find trapped populations. That means that the very poor, sometimes they don't have the means to migrate, at least internationally. Moving to the fast onset events. So what happened with climatic events like floods, droughts, earthquakes, landslides, and fires, and extreme temperatures, for example. Then what we found is that, again, at the country level, the effects are very heterogeneous. And this, we found it recently with a group of co-authors in Göttingen with Rafael Duarte and Felicitas Nowak. And we found that we had to distinguish between high and low poverty levels, and also between countries with prevalence of conflict or without conflict and violence, because the causal effect was different for these groups. Also, we distinguish between climatic zones, where the countries were mostly arid or tropical countries, and in some other graphs that I'm not going to show you, we distinguish between GDP level, between the level of gross domestic product. In a very few words, because I don't have much time, what we found is that indeed for higher poverty levels, we find that flood, for example, and drought were having a positive effect on the rate of immigration internationally. And this we see with the point estimates that are to the right of the zero. And when the interval doesn't contain the zero, those are confident bands. The same happens for lower poverty levels in the case of extreme temperature and floods, and this is the case for both arid and tropical countries. And when we move to conflict versus non-conflict countries, and with conflicts we mean countries that suffer from either internal conflict or violence or political instabilities, we find that the effects of these extreme phenomena on migration prevail in combination with conflict. So that means that when we find positive and significant events of these phenomena, for example, droughts or extreme temperature or fire and storms, are in countries that also suffer from conflict and violence. We also study the transmission channels. That means that when we observe that the rate of migration increases, why is that specifically? This is also mediated by the fact that there are many households that are vulnerable, and therefore the degree of vulnerability is one of the mediating factors, as measured by the UNDP with an index that is called EVI. And we found that specifically countries with droughts and conflict, they have high rates of vulnerability, and this is also leading to more international migration. And concerning extreme temperatures, these are causing actually decreases, important decreases in agricultural value added, and therefore of the means of living of rural populations that then also try to migrate in many instances, not only internally, but internationally. And the last transmission channel is extreme poverty, which also is related to higher average temperature in combination with conflicts, and this is leading to more poverty and in some instances to also to migration. Summarizing, what we have seen here is that yes, that migration can be indeed an adaptation, used as an adaptation strategy, and this is going to be more and more the case over the years if the climatic problem is not addressed. And just to mention what Antonio Guterres recently said, referring to the intergovernmental panel of climate change that opened the last report very recently, and also the previous report in 2021. He mentioned, referring to the last year reports that collect hundreds of scientific evidence supporting the fact that the climatic change is caused by human activity, and that we have to respond to this and we have to take care of the planet. And he referred to the first report as a code red for humanity, and to the second as an atlas of human suffering. So with this, you can already imagine what is the content of the report, that in any case is available, is freely available online. And already, well, referring to the report of the World Meteorological Organization in 2020, he also mentioned that the report was terrifying and that we were on the edge of the abyss, and therefore it's important that the countries take action, and the action they are taking and the national contribution that they are promising now are indeed not enough to accomplish the task, the huge task of avoiding that the average temperature is not going above 1.2 Celsius. That will mean that in many places of the world, we won't be able to live as we do now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Inma. That was a great presentation. Now I think it's back to me. I will be presenting a paper, a newest paper of mine, and with co-authors, of course. But who am I? I'm Els Bekaert, a large-year PhD student. I will be defending my thesis this summer, and I'm a PhD student in economics at the Ghent University and United Nations University on comparative regional integration studies in Belgium. So my PhD research has focused mainly on the role of environmental stress and health in shaping migration aspirations and the determinants of return and onward migration. I'm a coordinating member of the Climate Health Network and in the steering committee together with Professor Inma, and a member of the United Nations Climate Resilience Initiative formed after the European floods in Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands this summer. I will be very short on myself and now presenting a published paper together with some co-authors of mine. It's an interdisciplinary research covering researchers from a variety of disciplines and also including a lot of African partners in the study. So I'll be starting with my screen share and recording my time. Share, and then I hope you can all see my presentation. So the presentation I'm today talking about is called Family Physicians' Perceptions of Climate Change, Migration and Healthcare in Sub-Saharan Africa, an exploratory study. So we're focusing in this paper on Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, more specifically, a region which is most vulnerable to the impacts of anthropogenic climate change, partly due to its strong reliance on rain-fed agriculture. And when we talk about the nexus between, the nexus, and in general, it's a nexus between climate change, migration, health, and healthcare, like you see it here. So we look into the linkages between climate change it may have on healthcare, on migration, on health, and all the interlinkages between all the other components. For example, the effect of migration on healthcare and vice versa. And in this study, we put the African family physician in the center because still they are underrepresented in research on the climate change, migration, and healthcare nexus. As they are community-oriented primary care generalists, and at the entry point of the population's interaction with the health system, we believe we have to put them in the center of this nexus, and they provide us that they can provide us valuable insights into this nexus and into the building of capacity in the African continent through interacting health determining sectors for climate resilient and migration inclusive health systems. So the study, how did we go about it? We explored family physicians and primary caregivers' perceptions on the nexus in Sub-Saharan Africa and their views on intersectoral capacity building. So we conducted 3 focus groups with family physicians during a WONCA Africa conference, that is the World Organization of Family Physicians in Uganda. So all our focus groups were transcribed by Sub-Saharan African residents and analyzed using an inductive thematic approach. And you see here on the left map the area where our participants came from in the African region. What did we find with this complexity? Well, we find it to be an actually very complex nexus. There are complex and reinforcing interactions, which can be seen as continuous feedback loops. So I just want to give an example. So we see here again the nexus and with elements of climate change, migration, health, and healthcare, and how they are interacting together. But it might be easier with a concrete example. I'm having here the quote of a cyclone Idai in 2019 in Malawi, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe. We see here that the nexus interactions. So at work, so we see the cyclone Idai impacting health and further weakening the healthcare system, leading to an outward migration, either internal rural-urban or rural-rural or international migration. And this again weakened the host country's health system, impacting both the communities in the host region and the migrants' health. So the extent and the nature of those feedback loops may depend on the local demographic, institutional, and socio-economic context. For example, poorer regions with more vulnerable healthcare facilities may experience worse climate-related health impacts. So this is just one of the things the family physicians mentioned in their focus groups. So we see here the multiple effects of one extreme weather event at play. And we know by climate change, they will become more frequent. So the question is how to become more resilient. Here are again some quotes and or interlinkages we noticed from the fellow physicians. For example, after an extreme weather event, a lot of survivors who were living with HIV lost their medication when their homesteads were swept away. So they could not access clinics to get replacements for their medicines. And this is the same case with people being displaced or migrating. So they're lacking the access to their necessary medications. We see disrupted maternity care. We see a lot of people living in temporary housing, which tend to be overcrowded, either due in migration situations where people are displaced, and this forwards in airborne diseases popping up. A lot of contamination of water after an extreme weather event with waterborne diseases as a result. Very interesting here is also the mental health impacts, both from environmental events and from migration. So we see a despair, a fear and anxiety on the people. And even among the health workers and the rescue staff, we see a high rate of burnouts. Then again, trauma and injuries, which may not be treated urgently because the health system may be hit hard by the event as well. So which may result in lifelong disability and loss of livelihoods. And also we see long-term impacts, for example, disrupting of schooling and rebuilding of infrastructure. So the main takeaways we found in this nexus are quite in line with previous studies analyzing the interlinkages between the two. So it's so urgent that we consider the possible indirect impacts from climate-induced migration when assessing the climate-related health risks. So I'm also quoting another nice study about this, so highlighting the urgent need for this. But this paper's approach allows for a more pronounced position of other social determinants of health related to climate change and migration. And in this paper, we analyze the interactions as a myriad of continuous feedback loops, rather than seeing it as following a unidimensional structure, just going from, okay, climate change has an impact on migration and migration has an impact on health. No, we see it's like more in a complexity theory, a complex adaptive system. So we also asked about their views on intersectoral capacity building opportunities, and a few of them popped up. For example, the need of developing multidimensional and multi-layered governance structures, the improvement of family physicians training and primary healthcare generalists' working conditions, health advocacy in primary healthcare, collaboration between the health sector and civil society, and more responsibilities for the high-income countries and supporting this intersectoral capacity building. This is again a bit of a framework which popped up of the interdisciplinary capacity building. So we see it here on different levels. It goes from very an international macro level to very low level, where we say that we have to educate the public and raise awareness so they understand the linkages between climate change and health, and climate change and migration, health and migration, and migration and health. So this should actually be the main takeaway related to the capacity that popped up. So the curricula of family physicians should explicitly include the knowledge and management of health impacts of those environmental crises for which the African continent is very vulnerable to. And also it's very important to take note of the mental health difficulties related to experiencing climate change or forced relocation, or just the free choice to migrate and move to another place. So there has to be more intense involvement of the family physicians and primary healthcare practitioners in emergency planning and preparedness committees. And this would allow for better anticipation and perception of the needs. We also need an improved documentation of the lived experiences of movements on the health infrastructure, the local health infrastructure, both in origin and destination, and the outcomes of it on health. Family physicians and primary healthcare practitioners can contribute towards research arenas and policy responses, on several platforms, recognizing the urgency of the situation and standing up for how to be actively involved in changing it. So what brings the future? Well, together with the WONCA, World Organization of Family Doctors, we conducted an educational module on the nexus, explaining the linkages between migration, health, and climate change, migration, health, and healthcare, and how they might respond better in this situation, which also led to the Clinic Health Network, bringing together researchers and institutions and individuals working around this nexus. So I think this is about my time. So I thank you very much for your attention. And then I will stop the sharing. And I will give the floor then to Ashok Swain from Uppsala University, and he will be talking about climate migration and conflict. So Ashok Swain is a professor of peace and conflict research, UNESCO Chair of International Water Corporation, and the Director of Research School of International Water Cooperation at Uppsala University in Sweden. He received his PhD from the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi in 1991. And since he has been teaching at the Uppsala University. He has been a MacArthur Visiting Fellow at the University of Chicago, a Visiting Fellow at the UN Research Institute for Social Development in Geneva, and a Visiting Professor at the University of Witwatersrand, University of Science Malaysia, University of British Columbia, University of Maryland, Stanford University, McGill University, Tufts University, and University of Natural Sciences and Life Sciences in Vienna. He has written extensively on new security challenges, water sharing issues, environment, conflict and peace, and democratic development issues. Ashok, please give you the floor.
Ashok, you need to put on your microphone.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this generous introduction. It's really a tough thing to speak after this three great presentation and talking about the climate change and the climate migration in general. I will be talking mostly on the climate change and the climate migration leading to conflicts. As we all know that there has been I don't want to get into discussing what the climate change does, but we all know that increasing temperature, droughts, water scarcities, sea level rise, intense extreme weather events, floods, they are creating much more volatile food prices. It increases competition for natural resources, and that makes overall the livelihood less secure for the people, those who are living in particularly in the areas where they are mostly dependent on the natural renewable resources. Climate change also affects economic growth and development because there have been countries, those who are actually going through for a long period of time some kind of economic growth. If it comes to an abrupt end or it declines, then of course it affects the social cohesion. The governments lose its legitimacy, and that destabilizes regimes. The climate change also creating additional demands for state services because there have been 5 times more of natural disaster in the last 5 decades. And so those kind of natural disaster when it takes place, the country or the people do need assistance, relief and rescue and rehabilitation. Those sort of assistance in the aftermath of this needs, when the state has to be there, state resources has to be there. And if state fails, then it's of course creates challenges. Non-state actors come in. Climate change, as we all have been talking about, to act as a risk multiplier, intensify conflict, even if it doesn't create conflict itself, but it contributes to the conflict. because of the creating insecurity in the livelihood and the socio-political tensions. There have been in decreased number of military coups for several years or some decades now, but last year we saw 6 military coups, 5 of them in Africa, 1 of them in Asia. And those countries, I'm not saying that the climate change brought these military coups, but these conflicts are severely climate risk countries. If you look at this, because it's just to share that we have been talking about the slow onset and fast onset of the climate change, because this is also depends on the kind of migration which takes place. Slow onset of climate change will lead to a migration which is slow, gradual, but it will be mostly permanent. Well, the fast onset climate change leading to all these natural disasters might go for immediate but fast movement of people, but then there is a possibility that they will come back. And that adds to climate change. Whatever the slow onset or fast onset, it affects the environment, it leads to the economy. But I think we have a tendency to conclude not to take the politics and societies into account while we are talking about what will be the impact of the climate change or effect of the climate change on people. And that is extremely critical. Particularly, there are different countries or countries with strong political and social institutions. They will be able to, because they have much better capabilities to address the climate challenges rather than the others. So we need to look at the politics or the political part of it before jumping into or before moving into that conclusion. So leadership, what kind of institutions, what kind of social identities are there, how sort of internal migration or urbanization has taken place, how the minority situations and how the coping mechanism which is developed within the societies or not. Now, unless we looked at, we really not able to particularly see where this migration will take place, despite the fact that the climate change impact might be similar. No reliable estimate of the climate change induced migration yet. There has been, there has been numbers are coming, different numbers, number of climate weather relays has already increased, as I was mentioning, 5 times in the last 50 years. The forecast varies from 25 million to 1 billion. So it's a large difference, but I think what happens, the widely cited estimate is 250 million. But I think if you look at the total number of international migrants in the world now, it's around 260 to 265 million. So you can imagine the number doubling, and we are having the problem or the kind of different kind of populist problem, or the democracies are even in danger in many parts of the world, including this part of the world, because of the migration issue. And imagine the migration doubling in that time. So I think this is something which we or the world needs to be careful about. And we have been talking about how the migration hasn't been part of the climate migration has not been part of the refugee movement. That's the protection situation is problem, but also how to take the politics and societies of the receiving countries taking those migrants. What will happen? Because we are seeing the different migrations are being addressed in different ways. I mean, I did my postdoctoral research in the 90s, early 90s actually, on the environmental migration from Bangladesh. And I think things have changed quite a bit after that. But I think if you look at it, the migrant receiving regimes, they are opposing, some of the migrant receiving regimes oppose migration. It's a regime which opposes certain type of migration because it fits into their political dynamics, while the other type of migration from the different ethnic group, from the different race group, from the different religions, they will have a different or the different kind of socioeconomic status. So we see there is a difference there. Then migrants receiving societies also sometimes oppose migration, while the state might be supporting it. Like we see that in most of the Gulf countries, which are oil rich, there is receiving a lot of migration from Africa, Asia, and also Middle East. But there is an increasing societal opposition to the migration which is taking place. Sometimes regime accept migration, but society opposes. We have seen in the 2014, 2015, and that while some of the countries in Europe opened up their border, but there has been also societal opposition to it. Whereas in some countries where there is, like the US, when the Trump administration tried to close down the migration, but of course there was a societal pressure that they need more migration. In the UK, we can see it now at present, even despite the crisis in the Eastern Europe, the UK is not giving the visa. So there is a different, sometimes the regime opposes migration while there is a social support to the migration. Because there are different types of conflict we witness because of the migration issues. There will be when the migrant population, particularly the climate migration, would receive the receiving state. The receiving state might look at it as a much, consider it as a danger or consider it as a threat to its economy, society, or politics. All these things would be opposed, and there is a possibility of oppositions or the conflict and leading to violence between the migrant population and the receiving state. Migrant population and the receiving society, those kind of conflicts which the society consider the migrant populations taking their job, taking their social cares, or their culture is threatened. Those are the perceptions which comes in, and that will also lead to the conflict. Then those countries, those who are sending the migration or the migrants are coming from the country, and those to whom the migrants are moving, those kind of the treatment of these migrants on the way or at the receiving place or when they are living, that will also determine how the relationship develops between the central state and receiving state. And that can lead to a much more violent interactions at the different level between the two countries. Then the central state versus international community, because the international community might be looking at it as the central state has collapsed or some way that may not manage to. So those kind of migrants leading to the areas which might be international community opposing, or the receiving state not accepting these migrants or not giving them the possibility of a settlement or giving the possible support, might also opposed by the international community. So this is because of the time, I'm trying to finish it as soon as possible, but there are various aspects of how the climate migration can lead to the real violent conflicts between the countries and between the groups in the world. I will stop here.
Thank you, Ashok. Perfectly on time, even before time, so thank you for that.
Is that true? Because there is only 5 minutes left.
Yeah, 20 seconds left from your 10 minutes. So I think we're now at the end of our session, of our presentations, and now we can open the floor for a Q&A and a discussion. So I don't see any questions in the chats for now, but I think if you have a question, I think the participants can raise their hands with the button below. So I'm opening the floor for questions, please. Otherwise, they cannot. Oh, they can only use. So apparently, you can only use the chat to pose your questions. So please feel free to type any question you may have in the chat function. And in the meantime, I will maybe open with a question to my other panelists. So maybe it's quite an obvious question, but what is the biggest challenge we face about our topic on climate and migration today? So
can I
carry on?
I think there are two things. One is how we can really where the people will migrate and how many, because considering where the people will migrate, because as I've been working on this, at least as I mentioned, for 30 years now, it is very complicated that despite the similar type of climate crisis, there is a different type of migration takes place. And I think there have been talk about, like we saw that recently, that last year, the report which has come from the World Bank, because there has been always this thing that the poor people will migrate. It's not. There have been also rich people or the middle class income countries, people are migrating in the water migration. We are looking at it. And I have noticed that even in the 1990s, that the people, those who can really afford to migrate, they can migrate. The other thing which has been, in the beginning, Su-Ming was brought it, that the climate migrants not getting the refugee status. That is getting a major, major challenge for how to really, the world needs to look at it. Because what has happened now, because many of the rich countries, industrialized Western democracies, so-called democracies, they have stopped there, or they're trying to put the border restrictions that the people cannot come in. So many of these new migrants, those who are moving to the countries, those who are not democratic, they are semi-developed, they have been much more ethnically diverse. So we don't know how those countries in the long run will be going to accept it unless the international community develops certain kind of legal institutional framework how to address these migrants.
Anybody else on the panel would like to add to that?
I'll just simply reiterate that I think the fundamental challenge is inhumanity and dehumanization, as we can see the difference between the borders which have opened for Ukrainian refugees right now, fleeing the conflict which is devastating their country, and the situation of those only 2 or 3 months ago at the Belarusian-Poland border, who were faced with a government decree to spend 300 million on building a wall to prevent them from coming. And the refugees, mostly Kurds and Syrians, freezing to death in the forest, dying in the forest, being left there. And the criminalization of those who try to assist, which is something which is harmful to the humanity of those who are trying to assist as well, because our humanity, our ethical ability to relate to other people as human beings is dependent on the fostering and development of ethical know-how, the knowing how to help. It's when if you see a child is falling into the water, you do not have international negotiations. You put out your hand, you have ethical know-how, you know how to behave like a human being. And it's the dehumanization of certain categories of people at borders and these border pushbacks, which are horrendously dehumanizing our society in the face of big, big crises of war, conflict, and climate change.
Thank you, Su-Ming. And I see we have now a question in our chat from Samuel. I will just read it out loud. So how do we distinct between climate-motivated migration and migration caused by other factors like the current Russian invasion/war in Ukraine? What data captures climate-motivated migration? Anybody want to take the floor?
The real problem is not exactly the climate, the war-related or armed conflict forced migration. The real challenge comes into how you differentiate between economic migrants and environmental/climate migrants. And that has been a major problem from the very beginning. And how you really differentiate there are different ways we try to find a way how we can distinguish between economic migrants and then environmental migrants. That's on the basis of the push and pull factor. How much push and how much pull factor? Economists will answer that much better than I do, but I think what we look at it is what sort of push factor has really played the role. If the push factor is predominant, and then it's environmental, and in the absence of armed conflict, then it's an environmental climate issue. But in the pull factor is more then it's economic migrants. So I think it's a very tough one to distinguish. But Ukraine and the climate. Those are the quite easy to distinguish, but the problem challenge comes on when the economic migrants and the environmental migrants or the climate migrants come.
So that's why I use the Titiota case, because this is a case of a refugee who sought refuge because they argued that they had left their home part of Kiribati, the part of Kiribati, an island called Tarawa, because it was not possible to carry out economic life. They could not plant crops. They did not have fresh water. They did not have the possibility of livelihood with dignity and health, because their children had various illnesses because of lack of nutrition and just no economic opportunities. So in this case, it's not particularly helpful to distinguish between a climate-related migration and an economic migration, because the climate change had made fundamental economic life to create subsistence impossible for people. And yet he was found to have not fulfilled the threshold for direct threats to his life, and therefore he was returned to his country where they cannot live.
Yeah, only to add to is that that the sea level rise in some of the islands in the Pacific is a very good example. I mean, in this case, if the island disappears, for sure, those will be or are already some migrants due to climate change, and this is very clear. When we don't have this clear event or this clear fact, then we try to do it with the statistics and also, with trying to control for all the other factors and see whether still when you control for all economic factors, the climatic ones have a say. And therefore this can be done with some models and strategies to identify these effects.
Yeah, and I see popping up in the chat from OG. Indeed, it draws a lot of thought. At what point do we draw the line between economic migration and climate change induced migration? So I think we, Su-Ming, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I see there's a chat question from Salime, which
yes.
I'd like to answer.
Okay, so does it have any advantages for the countries that accept immigrants or not?
Yeah, so this is why I ended my talk with modern migration theory, which has used the example of Sweden. It's a fairly new book by Pio Hansen, an economist, and Swedish, and he has used the example of Sweden accepting 100,000 migrants since the 2015 migration, as they call it, crisis. And what did it actually do in terms of the local economy and the local communities, which were given more resources by the government to serve the immigrant community. And in fact, this created what I call fiscal space, and which completely overturned the idea that the reason why we limit migration is because we have to ration welfare, because we don't have money to pay for everyone's welfare. But just like in COVID-19, we have been turning to modern monetary theory, where the government basically prints more money and spends this locally on goods and services to help people. And this actually creates financial, social, and economic benefits, employment benefits, local community benefits, and service benefits for local economies. So that was an important question that I really wanted to answer, because it is one of those natural experiments that is bringing new thinking, that we don't have to think about the fiscal space in the same way.
Yeah, can I quickly? I think that if you look at the countries, those who are really population is in growth is not taking place in that number. The people age, there is a large need for the labor movement. They are restricting. And I think the restrictions is not on the economy. There is a immense, the world, whatever is reached now is because of migration. If we imagine if the migration wouldn't have been taken place, what the world would have been. So it is, there is always importance of migration for the new ideas, new economy, new development, those are there. But the problem takes place that how this has been politicized and how those politics is really reflected in really destroying democracies, creating challenge, bringing borders back into the countries, and those are the real challenge. So I think it is not that there is no doubt about the advantages of migrants, but the problem is how the politically those are being manipulated to create the challenges, and that is the real scary part of it.
Yes, I completely agree with both views, and indeed there are a lot of economic benefits from migration, like innovation when there is more diversity, and even with the aging population in Europe, we are going to need migrants for the care sector, and we are in need of receiving many migrants, but there is this opposition from the population sometimes because of a lack of information, I think, and therefore there is the need to translate this also into education and to transmit the fact that that migrants are indeed not they are contributing fiscally and also economically, and they are a win-win situation in many instances.
Sorry, I was muted. So that brings me to the question of Alexandra. What, in your view, should governments be doing in the face of the challenges of climate change migration? Anybody?
Okay, yeah, I can do that. But I think the government must have an open mind. The first thing is to really, the governments, those who can really invest in areas where the migrants should not, because, to help the adaptation possibilities that people will not really coming and displaced. So that is the most important thing. I mean, rather than really bringing people or people reaching your place, then I'm not saying only the developed countries. Even if you see within the developing country, developing regions, what is happening, the powerful regions are exploiting the not so powerful regions. And I think those are supposed to be that people will not stick to that place if you continue to do so. So I think it's a much larger planning, much larger ideas, taking into account that the mobility has taken place or the people will move. But I think the other thing, as we have been mentioning, that the countries need to be prepared that these are the migrants, those who will come, how they should be behaved or treated in the manner which the international law, international norms which are prescribed, like the people that you do. So I think there is importance of not only international law changing itself, but also our national and local laws needs to be also developed in a manner that they will be possible to address the situation in the future.
Yeah, and I have two more questions in the chat. One for me, in my research, did you explore the level of policy changes as an adaptation strategy to climate change in Sub-Saharan Africa? And no, we haven't in this study, but it would be really interesting to research this empirically. Then I'm having a question of Hamid Reza. Given the important issue of water resources, which is one of the important parameters in future migration, is there a reliable solution for communities not to leave their countries? Anybody has a thought on that?
Thus, the World Bank has brought out two significant reports on the water scarcity and migration, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa, where we were discussing before. I think the idea is Inmaculada was discussing, and I was also talking about it, because it is it's not the people. It's not bad that people are migrating. It's actually the people those who are not migrating or not able to migrate. And they are being in the poverty trap because they are not able to migrate. And that's really, we need to worry about them as well. So how the countries, where the migration will take place, where the migration will not take place, I have already told that what are the possibilities are, why countries migrate, and why people migrate, and how the migration can be, to somehow restrained. But I think this is much more important, how the migrants or the migrant crisis migration crisis reacts. Migration is not necessarily bad, but when the people migrate, how the societies adapt, how the migrant countries do adapt, how the way things are developing there. And I think that's where the politics needs to be looked at it much more carefully than what has not been before. So I don't think we should tend to think that we will be able to stop the migration. Rather, we need to think where the migration can be addressed, where the migration cannot be addressed properly.
And we have 1 more minute left for one final question from Samuel. How do we solve communal conflict as a result of internal climate change migration?
It depends on. So please, no.
I just wanted to give the floor to you, Ashok or Su-Ming. Yes, I think.
Well, only to say that a human rights-based approach is the only one, I think, but it shows you how environmental health and our dealing with our planetary crisis must, be within some framework for respecting people's lives and their basic equality, their basic need for fundamental necessities like water or livelihood opportunities. So it's not really the easiest answer, but I would say that's the only one that is, based on equality and not on hatred and violence.
Can I add just, thanks, but I think the communal conflict is how you're really using the communal nature into bringing it to the migrants. There have been large migration took place before from Bangladesh to India. It's a very controversial topic, but when I was looking at it, which really creates conflict, which doesn't create conflict in India. The Hindus who are migrating from Bangladesh because of environmental reasons, that was not creating conflict in India, but the Muslims, when they migrated, those created conflicts. And I think we need to realize that there are certain type of people in certain societies will be treated in a communal manner because that's what the politics and society is easy to brand them. And if that happens, the conflict will take place. So it is actually not the migrants' problem, it's how the receiving society is looking at them.
So I think we're running out of time. Alexandra, can you confirm, or we have one more minute for another question, or I think Su-Ming just answered in the chat. Alexandra?
I think you can go ahead and answer the question.
Yeah, Su-Ming, you can answer the question of Johanna. Time might be,
it was really, so normative accounts of normative ethics and moral philosophy, I think there is a basis, because I've talked about inhumanity. I think the discussion about humanity is about a certain kind of a normative morality, which is around the vulnerability of the human being and their claim on life and to be alive and to flourish. So there's some there, but it's also about pragmatic approaches and practical ethics, because I'm interested in this idea of ethical know-how and how are we able to know what is ethical in a way that is connected to doing what is ethical. So it cannot be a proper answer, because this is actually an important question Johanna has asked. But anyway, it's one that my opinion on it is not that important. Everyone has to work it out themselves.
So I think we are close to the end of our time together. So there will last me only one thing to do, and that is thanking all the presenters for the presentation and your presence in the session for the audience. And I would like to remind you again that for those who subscribed, there's a network event. You should have received a link. So hope to see many of you there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.